So these are the two books that I just referred to, and these are the ones that I'm going to broadly cover today. The first one, as I said, is called Rajadharma. These are the lectures that were delivered in University of Madras, and this book has been published in about 1941. The next one is Rajadharma Kanda, the volume which is a part of the broader corpus on Krtyakalpataru. And this again is a work that has been edited by Rangaswami Aiyangar. So a lot of the work is in Sanskrit, and I'm not somebody who's like trained in Sanskrit. So I relied on about a 100-page introduction that he wrote for this book, explaining the context of like what Rajadharma is all about. So that these are the two things that I'd be covering broadly in the talk today. So here, Professor Rangaswamy Aiyangar says that, so he's writing in the 1940s, right? So just pretty much in the pre-independence kind of an era. And for that era, he says that in the renaissance of Indian studies, which is a feature of our day, a branch which has not come to its own is Dharmashastra. Even among its special students, divergent views as to its character, scope, content, source, authority, and affiliations are not uncommon. He is really talking about 1940, which is, let's say, like 80 years ago, and things aren't really very different from then to now. Even today, while there is a lot of awareness in terms of like Indian culture, Hindu Dharma, and places like Indic studies and all that whole like Indic knowledge systems, IKS, all of that awareness happening, we don't have enough of a focus on this topic called Dharmashastra. So it's very strange that not much has changed in, let's say, like an 8 decades span of time. Rangaswamy Aiyangar here says that in the Hindu view of life, aims, ideals, and activities, they were not divided up and considered as independent of one another. There was no distinction between things secular and things religious. That distinction would have been unintelligible to the ancient Hindu. Society was viewed as indivisible except for distribution of duties and obligations. And on the equipoise of these duties duly discharged, whether of individuals, classes, or functionaries, upon this was held depend the harmony not only of a particular state or community, but of the entire universe. So thanks for the short and quick introduction. So today we'll be discussing the works of late Professor KV Rangaswamy Aiyangar with a specific focus on his works with relation to the topic of Rajadharma in a, at a high level, but mostly it will be in terms of understanding Dharma Shastras, understanding the role of Shastras, and all of that together. Because it's very difficult to compartmentalize these to say that this is Rajadharma, this is Dharma Shastra, this is Artha Shastra, that kind of thing. So I'm just trying to use Professor Rangaswamy Aiyangar's verse to emphasize on the broad continuum of how the Shastra universe operated in, for Hindu life. So just a quick background, I just picked this up from the event poster. So Professor Rangaswamy Aiyangar is a well-respected Dharmic scholar and a professor in history and economics from the 20th century India. So some of his published works, they include books like some aspects of ancient Indian polity, ancient Indian economic thought, and some of the works that he reconstructed and edited, they include Vyavahara Nirnaya of Varadaraja, Brhaspati Smrti, Lakshmidhara's Krtyakalpataru, and several other such works. So this particular lecture for today, it will focus on this book called Rajadharma, which in itself is a condensation of the lectures that Professor Aiyangar delivered in University of Madras in about like 30s and 40s. And then it also takes a lot of content from this long introduction that Professor Rangaswamy Aiyangar wrote for this very important book on Rajadharma and Dharma Shastra in general called Lakshmidhara Bhatta's Krtyakalpataru. So that in that Krtyakalpataru, which is like a multi-volume sort of a work on various aspects of Dharma, there is one particular volume on Rajadharma Kanda, and for that there is an elaborate introduction that Professor Rangaswamy Aiyangar has written, and that's the piece that I'm going to refer to today. So broadly speaking, I am going to focus on his lectures on Rajadharma that were delivered in 1940 or 1938, and then also a lot of content from the introduction that he wrote for Lakshmidhara Bhatta's Krtyakalpataru. Just a brief background about me as captured on the poster as well. So I I'm not like a Sanskrit scholar or a Sanatan Dharma expert or anything like that. Profession-wise, I work in the IT industry as a product manager. I have a background in MBA and the BTech in computer science, so quite modern in that note. But I have a very genuine interest in understanding my own tradition. And it is in that process that I keep engaging with great works like this. And the purpose of this talk today is really to spread the good word so that more and more of us from this generation engage with these works, because the works of this quality are very rare in our times today. And the whole intent is to just present how top-notch scholarship of the 20th century work and how they grapple with these topics back then. So these are the two books that I just referred to, and these are the ones that I'm going to broadly cover today. The first one, as I said, is called Rajadharma. These are the lectures that were delivered in University of Madras, and this book has been published in about 1941. The next one is Rajadharma Kanda, the volume which is a part of the broader corpus on Krtyakalpataru. And this again is a work that has been edited by Rangaswami Aiyangar. So a lot of the work is in Sanskrit, and I'm not somebody who's like trained in Sanskrit. So I relied on about 100-page introduction that he wrote for this book, explaining the context of like what Rajadharma is all about. So that these are the two things that I'd be covering broadly in the talk today. Sorry. All right. So let me just start off with a broad context setting in terms of Dharma Shastra and Rajadharma as a whole. So here, Professor Rangaswami Aiyangar says that, so he's writing in the 1940s, right? So just pretty much in the pre-independence kind of an era. And for that era, he says that in the renaissance of Indian studies, which is a feature of our day, a branch which has not come to its own is Dharma Shastra. Even among its special students, divergent views as to its character, scope, content, source, authority, and affiliations are not uncommon. So he's really talking about 1940, which is, let's say, like 80 years ago. And things aren't really very different from then to now. Even today, while there is a lot of awareness in terms of like Indian culture, Hindu Dharma, and places like Indic studies and all that whole like Indic knowledge systems, IKS, all of that awareness happening, we don't have enough of a focus on this topic called Dharma Shastra. So it's very strange that not much has changed in, let's say, like an 8 decades span of time. So here, Rangaswamy Aiyangar also says that the contact between European and Indian cultures in the 19th century, it produced in Hindus first an admiration for the former, which means for the European culture, and it induced an apologetic attitude for the supposed crudities of the latter, which is Indian culture. So we developed an admiration for Europe, and we developed some sense of like an apologia for our own crudities, or let's say Indian culture is outdated and things like that. And then from then on later, there came like a new love and pride for ancient literature. But this pride was also limited to certain aspects. So there was this whole study of Veda and its auxiliaries, classical Sanskrit literature, Indian philosophical systems, and things like that. Maybe a good marker would be like, let's say, the kind of books that somebody like Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan wrote. These are like largely for a Western audience, books on Indian philosophical systems, so on. But even in this kind of uh, spirit that emerged in that era, Dharma Shastra had little share in that revived interest. Maybe there was some odd book here and there on Manusmriti, but broad corpus of Dharma Shastra didn't get enough attention, even in that contact between Europe and Indian cultures that happened the past couple of centuries. But then Rangaswamy Aiyangar also says that Dharma Shastra was a living subject down to the threshold of the 19th century, which means up until 19th century, there was like very active scholarship that was being produced on Dharma Shastra. So here, he talks about this whole idea that we have today, that Dharma Shastra is maybe something that's like more religious and more related to priestly stuff. And then that's why it perhaps didn't get the kind of attention, and the more secular things like something on Artha Shastra or some work on like general ethics, these are the things that may perhaps have gotten attention. So countering that, Rangaswamy Aiyangar here says that in the Hindu view of life, aims, ideals, and activities, they were not divided up and considered as independent of one another. There was no distinction between things secular and things religious. that distinction would have been unintelligible to the ancient Hindu. Society was viewed as indivisible except for distribution of duties and obligations. And on the equipoise of these duties duly discharged, whether of individuals, classes, or functionaries, upon this was held depend the harmony not only of a particular state or community, but of the entire universe. So essentially what he's trying to say here is that this whole notion that we have today of dividing some things as secular and some things as religious, that didn't exist back then. And this is something that would have been unintelligible to the ancient Hindu. Society was all together. It was granted that there was a distribution of duties and obligations. So he's Rangaswami Aiyangar is by and large a traditionalist kind of a person, and he is not arguing against this fact that there was indeed a distribution of duties and obligations. So he's saying there was indeed a distribution, and then on the balance of these duties, it is upon that that the whole harmony of the state and community are dependent on it. So there was no division really that said like this part of your life is secular and this part of your life is religious. It was all together as one whole. And then it is from this that he jumps into this whole concept here, where he's trying to say that there is this popular notion that Arthashastra is like supposed to be more realistic and secular, and Dharmashastra is idealistic. So there's more and more attention on Arthashastra and less on Dharmashastra, even back like 8 decades ago. So here, for countering that, he says that if you look at various components of Dharmashastra, right, there is one part called Vyavahara, which deals with what today we would call secular aspects. So here he says that the selection of Vyavahara content of Dharmashastra for study is also due to the assumption that it alone dealt with the secular as contrasted with the religious aspects of Hindu life and activity. So again here he says such a division of the life of the Hindu is not, however, correct. Hindu thought does not recognize the distinction. Secular and religious considerations are inextricably interwoven in Hindu motives and actions. This feature is reflected in Dharmashastra. So again, he continues to emphasize this fact that from a Dharmashastra lens, there is no division of secular and religious. And hence, he counters this whole school of thought that kind of emerged back then in the 20th century, that the assumption of a secular as distinguished from a religious division in Indian legal and political literature is responsible for the magnification in modern times of Ardhashastra, supposed to represent the realistic and secular, as contrasted with Dharmashastra, reflecting the idealistic and religious. So people consider Ardhashastra as more real and Ardhashastra as having like dealing with secular things. And Dharmashastra is more like idealistic. Maybe it was only in the books and it was religious kind of thing. So he kind of counters that to say that this separation never existed in the Hindu mind. So here he says that just to emphasize this aspect again, he says that the indifference to Dharmashastras is still pretty general, and it may be traced to the feeling that things that matter like law and politics are wanting in such priestly books. So he says that when somebody like starts, let's say, studying a Dharmashastra book, they may find a lot of things there about like achara, about customs, about day-to-day practices, about life events and things like that. So this kind of creates an indifference in the mind of a student of law and politics, for example, because they feel that these are not things that matter and it's more priestly kind of things. But then here he contrasts the attitude of the then students of Dharmashastra with even, let's say, people like Colebrook or the Indologists of a bygone era, where even those Indologists and like colonial intellectuals, so to say, if you take the example of Colebrook, he obtained the grounding in Mimamsa, which is so vital to an understanding of Dharmashastra, before he translated the Digest of Jagannatha, which is like a Dharmashastra book. So here he's what Rangaswami Aiyangar is trying to say, that this whole compartmentalization that we have in mind, that this is law, this is politics, this is priestly stuff, this is religious. That kind of a separation was not something that even existed in scholarly tradition, even amongst colonial people back then. That the people were comfortable with the idea that to understand Dharmashastra, you need to have a grounding in Mimamsa, and they in fact put in the effort required to get that sort of an expertise. Here again, he gives one more example that there is also this popular thought which was existed there and it exists today as well, where there is also just like a religious secular separation, there is also this public-private kind of separation. So Ardhashastra is seen as public law and Dharmashastra is seen as private law. So here again, um, Rangaswami Aiyangar says that it is to miss the intimate relation between the Hindu state and family and the duty of the former to correct irregularities of conduct by members of the latter. So here he is trying to again counter this whole public-private separation kind of a narrative that we have, that even this separation that this realm is public and this realm is private also didn't exist from a pure Dharmashastra kind of a lens. So the Indian king was believed to be responsible as much for the correct conduct, which is achara of his subjects, and their performing the prescribed rites of expiation, which is prayashchita, as for punishing them when they violated the right of property or committing a crime. So today, when we think of law, we think mostly in the as in the last part of this sentence here, we think it is to deal with right of property, which is like civil law kind of thing, or committing a crime, which is criminal law. But here he contrasts this to say that for an ancient king, for an Indian king, it was not like that. The king was equally concerned about whether people are conducting their lives properly, whether they are doing if they commit a wrong act, are they doing the appropriate prayashchita, which is like a prescribed expiation for that act. Is their conduct correct, which means are they following the acharas as per their customs and the law of the land and things like that. So in this context, he says that the achara and prayashchita sections of the Smriti cannot accordingly be put outside the secular law. So this is again the reason why I'm bringing is to just bring a contrast between how things were then and how things are now. So today we just relegate all these things of achara and prayashchita to religion, and then we bring back things on civil law and criminal law to law. So we have like a separation between a secular law and then a religious law. And that is something that somebody like Rangaswami Aiyangar is countering. Sorry for my throat, I have some cough. Okay. So here he says that, so just to expand on this whole idea of public-private separation, sacred secular separation, he says that as per the traditional mind, life was seen as a continuum. It was not even interrupted by death because there's this whole idea of a punarjanma. So over deed and thought. So when you look at everything as a continuum without interruption by death, and then with such beliefs, you would never look into one specialized subject like Ardhashastra or Dharmashastra for final interpretation of the meaning of any rule of life or institution. So that is to be asked to be misled if you are expecting that a particular book will tell you everything. This is why he says that error pursues the heels of one who studies a section of Dharmashastra, let's say Vyavahara section of Dharmashastra, to the exclusion of others, or study Dharmashastra and Ardhashastra apart as if they are not cognate and interdependent. Specialization has its limitations. So this again is very different from how we operate today. So today, pretty much like we are in the like a European or a Western sort of a mindset when it comes to our education, and a lot of that is broadly driven by this whole concept of specialization. So you have to be an Ardhashastra expert. If you're an Ardhashastra expert, you cease to be a Dharmashastra expert. If you're a Dharmashastra expert, you're probably not the expert of some other Shastra, let's say like Alankara Shastra and things like that. But if you look at how the ancient intellectuals operated, they could straddle through multiple different subject areas. In fact, in this slides itself, there will be instances where you would see of kings getting into realms that today, which we do not even consider as politics. So there are kings who are interested in works on customs in terms of how rituals are done. And there are kings who they write their own works or they even commission works in those areas. And we already spoke about this example of somebody saying that I'll study Mimamsa before I understand the Shastra. So there was this whole separation that if you study Mimamsa, you're only like a Mimamsa expert. If you study Dharmashastra, you're only a Dharmashastra expert. That kind of a picture never existed. And that is because life was seen as a continuum and everything was interconnected. So there was this whole separation that this part of life can run independent of consequences or independent of influence from this part of life. That kind of a mindset didn't prevail back then. So here he again says that the allied distinction between Ardhashastra and Dharmashastra on the plea that the former deals with real politics and the latter with ideals, it overlooks the fact that when the judges and parties share the same ideals as expressed in Smritis, then these ideals were translated into action. And there was an idealistic element in Ardhashastra as much as it was in Dharmashastra. So again, here it's really countering this whole thing that what was there in Dharmashastra was just theory. There was no practice to it. It was just ideas. It was never implemented in real life, so on. So here he says that kind of a perspective will only come in when there's no shared uh, set of ideals between, let's say, the judge and the parties who are involved in a litigation. But when everybody is living in, let's say, the same sort of an ideal universe, like when the ground rules of everybody is operating on the lines of Dharma or Sanatana Dharma, then you wouldn't see this conflict. Then what is an ideal will essentially, over time and through various means, it will translate into action. Because ultimately, ideas have consequences. So if you have a certain idea and you make that ideal has to eventually, it will influence your day-to-day content in life. So that's how this whole idealistic element in Ardhashastra will exist, and it is as much present in Ardhashastra as much as it is in Dharmashastra. And these ideals will translate into action. There is no instance of something just remaining on paper and not translating into day-to-day conduct in the society. So here, Rangaswamy Aiyangar says that for a proper comprehension of our ancient life and thought, not only Ardhashastra, but the bigger literature of Dharmashastra is also needed. So here he says that the former has been examined pretty thoroughly, which means Ardhashastra has been studied quite well, but the latter still awaits a close study. And he's saying this in 1940s. Broadly, the situation is still the same, although maybe here and there a few people would have studied. But I think in general, as somebody living in the 21st century now, and the people grappling with what Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma means, I don't think as a people, even we have like spent as much time in trying to understand the import of the Dharma Shastra literature. And hence that part of how ancient Hindu life was organized is still a bit of a black box for us. So he also refers to this tendency where Dharmashastra is rejected or ignored as priestly twaddle, which means essentially that it is something that some Brahmins wrote and it's too idealistic and it has got too many things on rites and rituals, too many rules, too many regulations, that sort of a thing. So he counters this by saying that there is no meaning in writers who display a subtlety and robustness of mind comparable to the best of lawyers of our age, or for that matter, in any other age. And he gives examples of Dharmashastra scholars like Vigneshwara, Lakshmidhara, Jimutavahana, Madhava, Raghunandana, so on. Why would these people spend so much of their adult time and active time on the elaboration of the parts of Dharmashastra, which are today rejected as useless? So he's trying to counter this whole aspect that today Dharmashastras may be rejected as priestly twaddle or rejected as useless. But then we have to kind of zoom out and step back to understand why were these considered important by our ancients, and why did all these legal scholars, to use today's terms, why did they all spend so much time in elaborating all these? And as we see through the course of this presentation, kings were also commissioning these works. So why would they do that if they are just like irrelevant and if they have like no real life consequences? So here, um, Rangaswamy Aiyangar also kind of elaborates this whole distinction. So just like how you have sacred secular distinction, public-private distinction, there is also this whole sin and crime kind of a distinction, uh, to use like a Western kind of a nomenclature. So sin is usually associated with religion, and crime is usually associated with the secular realm. So here he says that the legal capacity is held to rest on spiritual, and legal competence can be affected by ceremonial impurity, by the commission or omission of particular religious duties, and by their performance at proper and improper moments. This is why the treatment of something called asaucha, which is a traditional term used for impurity arising from birth or death, Kala Nirnaya, which means the determination of the proper time for doing prescribed things, these occupy a large space in Hindu legal literature. So he's trying to explain this piece that in the Hindu legal literature, these things like Asaucha and Kala Nirnaya are not relegated to religious duties. because you performing religious duties also has an implication in terms of the legal questions that are at play. So the legal competence can be affected by ceremonial impurity. That's what he says here. And so critical is this, that a writer as Jimutavahana, he found it necessary to write beside his two books on inheritance and procedure, which is Dayabhaga and Vyavahara Matrika, a much larger treatise on the determination of the suitable time, which is Kala Viveka. And Madhavacharya also wrote a book on Kala Nirnaya. In old Indian criminal law, as in other archaic penal law, spiritual and secular punishments were intermixed. An offense was treated as both a sin and a crime. So here, he's trying to draw this parallel that it's not just the Indian criminal law, and even if you go back in time to archaic penal laws, spiritual and secular punishments were intermixed. So the way things operated, if you take the example of Jimutavana here, he was a Dharmashastra scholar. He wrote these very popular books or classical texts like Dayabhaga and Vyavahara Matrika. But he didn't stop there. He also wrote a book called Kala Viveka. He didn't say that Kala Viveka seems to be something to do with religion. I am an expert in inheritance, which is like civil aspects of law and things like that. That is not how our ancient scholarship operated, because they didn't compartmentalize these things to say that this is a religious duty and this is a secular sort of a rule book. So that's the contrast that he's trying to draw. And here he says that an offense was treated as both a sin and a crime. So it is when you commit a particular act, that act will have a religious consequence and a secular consequence. So the spiritual and secular punishments, they were intermixed. This is the contrast he's trying to draw between how a dharma-based legal infrastructure would work versus how a pure play secular model would work. So from here, I'll just do a brief segue into the book on Lakshmidhara's Krtyakalpataru. So after building all of this context around Rajadharma and how Dharma had sacred and secular intertwined together, and this whole separation between religion and secular didn't exist, Rangaswami Aiyangar gives an example that if you are looking for a complete Dharma digest, then Krtyakalpataru of Lakshmidhara Bhatta is a very good example. He says that it's the oldest available and one of the most comprehensive and authoritative book. It adopts a special arrangement not found in other digests. And this book, interestingly, it was written on a king's order. So the king actually said, I want to know what is the entire expanse of Dharma, particularly Rajadharma. And then he commissioned this work, and Lakshmidhara, who was a minister in the king's office, he went ahead and wrote this book. So here, the book is a multi-volume book, as I said at the start. And here Rangaswami Aiyangar says that the way Lakshmidhara proceeds with this book is that he takes the life of a man to begin with the conception in the womb and then end in moksha. So it is like it starts with birth and then it ends with salvation. So Hindu jurisprudence also operates that way. So the Lakshmidhara expounds the traditional view of the public and private use of duties of man in a sequence following the progress of life and station. The first book begins with period of dedicated study, which is Brahmacharya. The second is devoted to the Grihastha, which is the householder. And the third to the daily and periodical duties, and the which is Niyatakala, proper time for performance of daily and periodical duties. And then the offering of oblations to ancestors is an essential duty, signifying the continued existence of family. So the ceremonies connected with this duty, which is Shraddha ceremonies, they occupy the fourth book. And he goes on to describe every single book in this volume. So it is in this sequence that this book on Rajadharma also comes. So here, again, if you look at it, Rangaswami Aiyangar is not trying to compartmentalize things to say that this is religion, this is secular, this is the realm of Dharmashastra, this is the realm of law, this is the realm of Ardhashastra, so on. So here he is trying to say that even if you go back to a 11th century, 12th century book like the one written by Lakshmidhara, it was very comprehensive. It was like an end-to-end sort of a conception of Dharma, and there was no compartmentalization whatsoever here to say that this is a secular realm and this is a sacred realm. So here again, he asked this question, which is something that we should all also ponder in our types today, particularly given the a lack of attention and lack of patronage at large of Dharmashastra scholarship in our age. So he asked this question that why did this Dharmashastra scholarship persist? So he says that the wonderful activity in the cultivation of Dharmashastras continued almost without cessation, even in the middle of wars and foreign invasions, and was sometimes even helped by them. Meaning, because there is a war or an invasion, somebody will actually commission the compilation of these works. So here he asks this question that what is the cause of this foreign acts? What is the compelling influence which gave the subject an enduring vitality and power of recuperation? And an answer to these questions throws light not only on the vitality of a subject, which was closely associated with religion and regulated modes of life, but it also reveals the special features of governments of the time and their relation to the life of the people. So he says that Dharmashastras was never something to do with like just theory or just something that a set of scholarly Brahmins just wrote just to keep themselves occupied. It had a very specific role to play in the traditional life. And this is where he is trying to ask this question that if you look at centuries over centuries, even though there were wars, even though there were invasions, the cultivation of the Dharmashastra scholarship never stopped. There was massive amount of activity that happened up until even like the 19th century. There was a lot of activity happening on Dharmashastras. So that's where he asked that we need to understand the vitality of this particular subject and why did it even persist for so long. So here, I want to emphasize on a particular configuration or a particular conception, which is popular for people who are aware of like Mahabharata and Smriti so on. So this is called Raja Kalasya Karanam, which means the king is the maker of the age. So here, uh, Rangaswami Aiyangar says that Dharmashastra, like religion, it dealt with the whole life and not with only a part of it. No one was outside the jurisdiction of Dharmashastra. The individual, the family, the corporations, the king, they were all in its ambit. It upheld the ideal of an indissoluble union between state and society, the king and the subject. The welfare of the king was held to be rooted in the well-being of the people. Political union was sanctified by religious sanction. And the king and the danda, which is a spirit of punishment or the power of sanction, they were both of divine creation. Anarchy was abhorred, and a condition of statelessness was conceivable only in the golden age, which is like the Satya Yuga. And then the doctrines of karma and samsara link life in this world with other existence and with the world order. A reciprocal influence generated by dharma was believed to connect right or wrong living with cosmic influences of a supernatural character. So broadly, he's talking here about how the whole punya, papa, karma, and punarjanma, that whole cycle kind of comes together in terms of moderating your day-to-day conduct. So good government ensured the happiness of the people, and it did so by bringing into operation beneficent influences which made happiness certain. Under ideal rule like that of Lord Rama, unhappiness and sorrow were unknown. A good king reproduced the conditions of the golden age, and a bad one intensified the sufferings of the iron age. So iron age here is the Kali Yuga. And on the king lies a responsibility which cannot be shifted or shifted. He is the maker of the age, Raja Kalasya Karanam. So here he is trying to kind of draw a whole continuum between the role of Dharmashastra and how it influenced the conduct, day-to-day conduct of a religion, and the role of the king, and then how the king is the maker of the age. So this is where the whole discourse on Rajadharma and Dharmashastra kind of like comes together. So here he gives an example of how specific dynasties. So these are all dynasties around 11th and 12th centuries, like the Garvas of the Kannauj, which is related to this work of Lakshmidhara on Krtyakalpataru, which was commissioned by a king from that particular dynasty of Kannauj. And there were the Paramars of Malwa, the Yadavas of Devagiri. These were just examples of a lot of Hindu Rajput dynasties from that era. And they were all fervently Hindu. Nothing but wholesale recapitulation of Dharma Shastra would satisfy them, which is why large digests became the fashion in every court. So here he is trying to draw back then, which is in the 11th to 12th century, how Dharma Shastras and the royal courts kind of were stitched together. That the large digest became the fashion in every court because the kings themselves wanted to understand what does it mean to be dharmic. So the kings wanted to understand Rajadharma, the kings wanted to understand Dharma Shastra, and the kings wanted to understand the broad sphere of how a king should govern to be dharmic for his kingdom to thrive with dharma. There was that sort of interest in these dynasties, and it is this that led to some of this scholarship on dharma shastras back then. So here, of course, any discussion on dharma shastras, Rajadharma, you cannot avoid the topic of Varnasrama Dharma, which of course today uh, is quite controversial, and it triggers people because there was a certain worldview back then around things like heredity, which today we consider those ideas are kind of abhorrent for us today because they fly against the Enlightenment values of liberty, equality, and so on. So be that as it may, I'm not getting into any prescriptive sort of a model here. I'm just trying to elaborate in terms of how our scholars from the previous generation understood Dharma and how kings of the 11th and 12th centuries and their people back then operated. So it is in this context that we need to look at these remarks on Varnasrama Dharma, and these are not necessarily prescriptive for anything that is happening in contemporary times today. So here he gives the example of another scholar, Mitra Mishra, who accepts of authority the practice of a good Shudra, which is Sat Shudra. And apparently it is a concession to the educated and pious member of the fourth Varna, bringing the extension under the practice of the good in the place of the practice of the strict Brahman. So there is this whole notion of a Shishtachara, where a Shishta is supposedly like a learned Brahmin or a learned scholar of Shastras and tradition, and who is also a practitioner who follows Shastras in his day-to-day. So to that, Mitra Mishra, who is another scholar of the Dharma Shastras, he also accepted as authority the practice of a good Shudra. So it was not something that was considered as a something that is exclusive to Brahmins, and the practice of a good Shudra was also considered as an ideal. So here, Rangaswami Aiyangar also talks about that this whole animus against the learned Shudra was really due to the abhorrence of Jains and Buddhists for their abjuring the Veda and for their wholesale invitation to the Shudras to desert their occupations and become monks. So here I think some of these passages are here primarily just to explain the kind of change that we went through as a society and how the Shastras kind of responded to this sort of a change. So if you look at how Buddhism operated in practice, there was a lot of emphasis on the monk tradition. And to convert people to monks, you have to give up your occupations. And sannyasa in general, as per a lot of the tradition back then, it was not something that was prescribed to anybody and everybody, and there were a lot of norms associated with it. There was really no missionary zeal around trying to increase, let's say, the number of monks or sannyasis, and there was no active recruitment that was done. And that was something that changed specifically with the Buddhism. And it is in this context that Rangaswamy Aiyangar is trying to say that perhaps initially there was indeed that animus because uh, the tradition or the Dharmic tradition actively tried to prevent from people giving up their occupation and them becoming monks, because that will introduce a kind of imbalance in the society. We don't want to see like a lot of people giving up worldly life and then taking the monkly life. And with the fall of Buddhism, there was a marked reduction of the assertivity even towards the Buddhists. That's the remark that he makes, which means that there was a dynamic at play. So maybe at one point in time, there was indeed this animus, but then later that changed as Buddhism kind of subsided, and this whole zeal or this whole active conversion pressure to convert people to monks perhaps died down. And that's when maybe like tradition kind of readjusted again. So here again, he gives another example that the reaction against Buddhism and Jainism that led to an emphasis on marriage. Also because these religions admitted women as nuns. So specifically in Buddhism, I think it is quite well known that there was indeed a whole uh, lot of women who were admitted as nuns, and they used to participate in the monkly tradition there as well. So again, this was somewhat unknown to the Hindu tradition because there was no active push for women to become sannyasis or nuns in the Hindu tradition. And it is here that he tries to draw this contrast, that even when you look at some of these rules that came up as a part of Varnasrama Dharma, you should probably look at it in the context of all of these other things happening around. So here he again gives an example that, so if you look at the traditional ideas on separation or divorce, there's a lot of scholarship in terms of how there are like so many variations. So it was actively prohibited for some groups, not for some. Maybe there was a time where some sort of permission for separation existed. So here he says again that there is a pressure that came, or there is a fear of the encroachment of Buddhism on the family by attractive wives to nunneries. Because there was this pressure where women were being attracted to sannyasi or the nun sort of a tradition, the rules became stricter and stricter in terms of indissolubility of the marriage type. Because the Dharma is all about balance, and there was no interest in trying to let the family as a unit that should not break. So, which is where this fear of encroachment of Buddhism on the family did exist at a certain point in time, and hence this indissolubility of the marriage tie perhaps became stricter. That is one hypothesis that Rangaswami Aiyangar puts forward here. And then the emphatic condemnation of prolonged celibacy and the advocation of the householder status also may be due to a reaction against the glorification of renunciation of women as well as for men. So if you look at the Hindu tradition, perhaps it is something that distinguishes the Hindu traditions from a lot of uh, other traditions back in that era and even now. If you look at how even our gods, we are not a tradition that looks at a celibate god, or our priests also, we don't adulate this whole idea of a celibate priest. Like let's say Christianity, for example, we do have Grihastha priests, and those are the Archagas and Purohits who dominate our day-to-day religious content. So this whole householder status or the married life or the Grihastha life, the Grihastha Jivana, that is put at the highest pedestal in our tradition. And there is a condemnation of prolonged celibacy. So celibacy is not something uh, that is kind of adulated and that is advised for anybody and everybody. The advocacy for everybody is to get married and retain the householder status. So here he says that there is a pressure again that if you look at a religion like Buddhism, it put the sannyasi or somebody who has given up on all the rules and all the householder sort of rules, it put that person in the pedestal. And the whole emphasis on the householder status in the Hindu tradition, otherwise, it may be due to this reaction against the glorification of renunciation. So we don't want a scenario where a whole, like, let's say the vast majority of the society is in, the women are in nunneries and men have become monks. That is not the society that Hinduism kind of conceptualizes. So it is in an attempt to counter these pressures, that is where perhaps some of these rules have gotten stricter over time. That's a hypothesis that Rangaswamy Aiyangar puts across. So here again, uh, he says that when we are trying to understand Dharma Shastras and when we are trying to understand Rajadharma, we need to also understand that we should not go with facile and superficial considerations uh, here to explain the continued vitality of the culture and the religious beliefs on which it is based. Because we are talking about centuries and centuries of vicissitudes, foreign invasions, conquests, and wholesale persecution that we faced as people. Any other civilization would have been just extinguished in other lands. But in our land, Hinduism persisted through these vicissitudes and through these centuries and centuries of foreign invasions and conquest. So here he says that a frequently ravaged society, the fact that it was able to maintain its essential unity and cherished ideals and modes of life through such calamities and through such a long stretch of time, adapting itself within the limits of its fundamental beliefs to the calls of altered needs, and that it ensured to its members a considerable degree of happiness and freedom, with a temper to make use of them. These are claims which may be urged on behalf of the great body of tradition and literature called Dharmashastras. So here he is trying to say that it is because of these body of tradition and literature that you have called Dharmashastras, that is the one that enabled your society to retain that essential unity and cherish those ideals and modes of life, despite all of these uh, pressures and threats that you have been facing. And it is this Dharmashastra tradition that also enabled for recalibration, to adapt yourself within the limits of your fundamental beliefs, and to also alter your needs. And there is this whole dynamic at work here. It's not very rigid, but it is also there is also this whole limits of fundamental beliefs that are mentioned here. So it is not like you can do anything and everything, but at the same time there is also a sense of legal pluralism. There is also a bit of tolerance for uh, plurality with respect to achara, with respect to customs. Uh, and it is also not like the king is listing down things one by one in a textbook and distributing it to people. There was a multitude of bodies, there were a multitude of community authorities, and there was a lot of pluralism also at play. But at the same time, there was also a fundamental essential unity. And broadly, there were some ideals which we as a people cherished over centuries. So it is here that the fact that these things have persisted, to understand why these things have persisted, and that is where we need to understand this great body of tradition and literature called Dharmashastras, to understand what was its role in ensuring that all of these kind of persisted through these calamities in the such like long stretches of time. That is the emphasis that Rangaswami Aiyangar is trying to put here. So here he says that we need to study the scope, aims, and implications, along with that of the ways in which it renewed itself from age to age, that may prove of use not only to those who accept it without question, but even to those who ardently wish for social change in the interest of wider well-being. Among a vast population in which a great many persons have still the faith in it, which will help them more readily to accept change if it is in consonance with tried ideals and methods. So in every era, right, if you look at the pressures, there's always a conservative uh, populace who wants to cling on to the ways of life of what has been handed over to them from their ancestors. There is always the reformist who wants to reform and change things because the broader circumstances have changed, or the ideals have changed, or the times are just not the same. You cannot implement something that just worked for your ancestors, so on. So there are these pressures always, which is where Rangaswamy Aiyangar here says that the study of the scope of Dharmasastra and Rajadharma, its aims and its implications, will be useful not only for those who accept these Shastras without questions, it will also be useful for those who ardently wish for social change. Because the people at large still have faith in Shastras. The day-to-day conduct of religion is still largely driven by Shastras and Acharas. They also people conduct a particular festival in a certain way. They have a certain notion of married life. They have a certain notion of taking care of their parents. They have a certain notion of morality. All of this is coming because of whatever has been passed on to you from your ancestors. So a great many persons still have faith in this. And it is here he says that change may be introduced, but the change should be in consonance with tried ideals and methods. And that is the justification for the review that has been attempted here in terms of these lectures by Professor Aiyangar, where he is trying to explain the role of Shastras and Rajadharma. And he is also saying that the tradition renewed itself from age to age. It was not like it was all the same era to era. Things were changing, but things were also the same. So there is this whole dynamic that was always operating. And it is here that he is emphasizing this part, that both the people who are seeking reform and also the people who are seeking continuity, both will find value in trying to understand this whole Shastra and Rajadharma sort of a universe. So here he kind of emphasizes the difference between the Indian view and a non-Indian sort of a perspective. So here he says that not only modern legislative acts, but even such statements of moral ideals as the Christian Decalogue, which is like the 10 Commandments, they state what should not be done. The position is negative. So it is more about you like thou shall not. So you should not do this kind of a position. But in the Dharma Shastra, on the other hand, one is told what should be done and what any particular person should not leave undone, which means these are things that you need to do. So there is a kind of what is called like a vidhi sort of a notion in tradition, which means that this is what must be done. And that is being taught by Dharmashastras and Acharas, so on for you. So this difference reflects a fundamental difference in outlook. In the Indian view, man is animated as a bundle of duties. So you are seen as somebody who has to discharge a bunch of duties. And when everybody does his or her duty, universal harmony results. So the neglect of one's duty recoils not merely on the delinquent, but upsets the whole established order. So if you don't do your duty, it has consequences on the entire order. And the magnitude of evil which might follow individual default and afflicting the society calls for a corresponding strength in the regulating authority, which will reduce the lapses from duty in number and gravity. So this is where again this whole idea of state and Rajadharma, all of that comes back into the picture. That there is, if you start looking at man as an animated bundle of duties, then the regulating authority, which is the state or the king, their emphasis would be in terms of whether everybody is conducting their duties appropriately or not. And the weight of the authority of the whole community should be behind the maintenance of Dharma. The head of the community, that is the ruler, or its spiritual and intellectual leaders, they should exercise this power. So here he is trying to draw this contrast between how, let's say, a Christian law operates and how an Indian law, like be it Hindu or a Brahmanical law, Jainist law, Jaina law, or a Buddhist law operates. So that when we, even in Buddhism, for example, there is this whole notion of Dhamma that is used, which is, a lot of it is inspired from Dharma, as the professor himself writes in this book. So if you look at this whole conception of looking at an individual as a bundle of duties, then somebody has to tell you what the duty is. And it is in that aspect, again, the whole Shastra universe, Dharma Shastra, Rajadharma, Achara, and all of that comes back into the picture, because they are trying to tell you what should be done. So this is a contrast between the Western view, or like a post-colonial view in which we are operating, where it's more around rights and more around liberty and what I want to do versus what I should be doing. So this is the contrast that Rangaswami Aiyangar is trying to draw between the Indian view. And he's also trying to like put an emphasis in terms of what is the role of king or the Rajadharma in trying to ensure that these duties are discharged by everyone. So here again, he emphasizes this part that in an organized society, the ruler alone can apply in all such cases the requisite social pressure. The upkeep of dharma on its protean forms becomes therefore the first duty of the state and its head. All dharma is Rajadharma. The reach of the state's duty extends to every form of activity. So again here, by saying all dharma is Rajadharma, he is trying to emphasize the fact that the king is responsible for the conduct of dharma in his society. So the ruler alone can apply the kind of pressure that is required to make sure that people don't skip performing a particular duty that they ought to do as per what the tradition commands. So here, the way to look at it is not that the king himself is going to dictate everything here. In fact, if you look at the traditional discourse, the king himself is subservient to the overarching dharmic ideals. So this again is a bit different from how some other societies looked at the king and the king's discharge of duties. So in the case of the Hindu tradition, when we say all dharma is Rajadharma, it is more in terms of the king's responsibility in ensuring that everybody performs their duties. So to that extent, the reach of the state's duty extends to every form of activity. That is the emphasis that Professor Aiyangar is putting here. So again, as I said, we cannot avoid this topic of Varnasrama Dharma. It keeps coming into any discourse that you pick on Dharma Shastras and Rajadharma, it keeps coming back. So just to reiterate, I'm not being prescriptive here in terms of how we need to operate in our times today. It is just in terms of understanding how tradition operated back then and what is the traditional conception in general in terms of the interplay between Rajadharma and Varnasrama. So here, if you see that the belief in the entire system of the universe being divinely ordained and governed by an immutable system of castes and orders, whose equipoise is a necessity for universal harmony, is responsible for the craving for a strong power able to prevent any disturbance of the social order and to keep everyone within his bounds. So this again is a bit different from what a lot of modern day liberal commentators adopt on this topic, where they indulge in a bit of denialism to say that this never existed, this came from the British era, or this came from the Mughal era. Otherwise, we are very like a liberal sort of a culture, and people had the liberty and freedom to do whatever they want, so on. But Professor Aiyangar, being somebody who's trained in tradition and who is like trying to understand things as they were. He doesn't shy away from saying that there was indeed an aspect of immutability with respect to how the system of castes and ashramas or orders operated. And there was indeed the Rajadharma was indeed operating to make sure that everybody stayed within their bounds. So the transgression was something that was usually avoided. So the king tried to ensure that everybody stayed within their bounds. And a stateless, or to use the more common expression, a kingless condition spells anarchy, confusion, and violent dislocation of social order. So the king, let's say, doesn't conduct himself as the way he is expected to conduct, then there is a violent dislocation of the social order. So the restraint on individual volition and freedom, which Varnasrama implies, because it takes away the option to change one's caste or occupation, that necessitates as a logical corollary the existence of both an external agency that can maintain the restraints and arrangements which will induce willing and habitual submission to the restrictions on freedom. So again, this is a bit different from what a lot of modern day liberal or modern commentators on Hinduism adopt, because these things kind of make us uncomfortable. The fact that tradition actively prevented individual mobility within the same generation, and there was indeed some sort of a strictness with respect to changing your occupation and changing your caste. And there was indeed an interface between Rajadharma and Varnasrama on this aspect as well. But perhaps the way to look at it is that the way it was operating is that there was a restraint on individual volition and freedom. And Dharma, the way it was operating back then, it was not about the freedom to do whatever you want, which is how today people kind of offer a commentary on it that Swadharma is essentially your ability to do whatever you want. But that's not how things operated back then. Perhaps it is configured, possible to reconfigure it for contemporary times that way. That's not something that I am aware of in terms of the possibilities. But for the purpose of this text, it is just to understand how things operated back then. And it is here that Professor Iyengar doesn't mince words, and he says that it is indeed Dharma was putting a restraint on individual volition and freedom, and Varnasrama does indeed take away the option for somebody to change one's caste or occupation in that lifetime. Of course, as I told at the start of this conversation, tradition looks at life as a continuum, and death itself is not a full stop. So it continues towards like to the next janma or next life as well. So that's like a different way of looking at things, which may not necessarily suit a modern mindset. But the takeaway from here is that this whole discharge of duties, there was indeed some aspect of immutability there, and it was not as mutable as it is made out to be today. And perhaps even today, it's perhaps not that mutable, that maybe even today, although there are some situations of some level of mobility that one sees, but it's not like everybody can become everything, and it is not like intergenerational, like same generational upward social mobility is a reality for anybody and everybody, even today across the world, and particularly so in India. So maybe that's how we need to perhaps understand this sort of a model where there is this whole immutable system that is being portrayed on one end, and then on the other side, in the modern mold, we have an aspiration for same generation upward mobility for every individuals, which is coming mostly like from a French Revolution, American dream sort of a mindset. So here, I'll just take a few moments to also talk about some aspects of Rajadharma, which are not necessarily tied up to controversial topics like Varnasrama Dharma. Uh, so even if you keep all of that aside, let's say you take away this whole idea of immutability with respect to castes and occupations and all of that, and just focus on uh, this whole interface between Dharma and atheism. So here you would say you would see that tradition it kind of adulates or it kind of recommends a constant association with virtuous and learned men. That is what is held up to the king as of lasting benefit to himself and to the kingdom. On the other hand, an atheist or a blasphemer must be kept out, and the cultivation of philosophy must be in branches which are not opposed to the scriptures. So there is a word here used which is called Veda Aviruddha. which means it's not something that goes against Vedas and Shastras broadly. So you can say it is Veda Viruddha and Shastra Viruddha as well. So uh, here, what the contrast is being drawn is that whom should the king uh, keep in his inner circle? That's perhaps one way of looking at it. So then the recommendation is that the king should have a constant association with virtuous and learned men. And these are the people that the king should have intellectual discourse. On the other hand, an atheist or a blasphemer must be kept out. And even the cultivation of philosophy that should be actively kept in realms that are not like against, like explicitly against the Vedas. So that's the recommendation that Rangaswami Aiyangar is referring to here. Again, here he says that the motive to right conduct and restraint of wrongdoing, it must be based on a conception of morality which finds its meaning in the faith that goodness is grounded in God, that He alone is perfection, as well as the ground and goal of goodness, and that all action must aim at an approximation to Him. This is the Dharmic view. It is particularly applicable for restraining autocratic authority. So here is trying to explain this whole notion today that we have that secular morality is possible, which means take away God from the picture, take away religion from the picture, not just this religion like Hindu religion, take away all religions and come up with something else which will govern right conduct and restraint of wrongdoing. And I don't think like as a people and as a culture, there is this thing called secular morality has really emerged and it has worked wonders not just here, but not anywhere in the world as well. So here, the Dharmic view, as Rangaswami Aiyangar says, the Dharmic view is strictly grounded on in God, and the conduct and restraint of wrongdoing, it must be based on the conception of morality, which finds its meaning in the faith that goodness is grounded in God. So this whole separation that to say that uh, I am an atheist, I'll go by my rules, that is not the Dharmic view. And here, uh, just to emphasize, Rangaswamy Aiyangar also says that the Charvaka or Nastika or the Pashanda recognizes no standard but his own, and a king who under their influence will degenerate into the slave of his own impulses and sensual cravings to the ruin of himself and the kingdom. So here he says that the moment you say that there are no standards, that there is no authority like a Shruti or a Smriti or even an Achara tradition that I am measuring myself against, and my like my own whims and wishes are my own standard, which is typically the Charvaka or Nastika position. Then a king who under their influence, he will also degenerate to become the slave of his own impulses and sensual cravings. And there's nothing dharmic about it. So the atheist's crime, he says, undermining the foundations of moral conduct. That is why the writers on Arthashastras also condemn his association. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is that even let's say if you don't want to get into the religious aspects of Dharma Shastras, of how you conduct yourself around life events, around birth in the family, around a death in the family, around how you conduct festivals and things like that. Even if you're not interested in the Varnasrama Dharma aspects of Dharma Shastra, because it flies against, for the lack of a better term, it flies against the enlightenment morality. Uh, Even if you keep those aspects aside, at least this part of Dharma Shastras need attention, because here at least it's clearly calling out that there is something called a dharmic view, and the atheist morality or the Charvaka morality runs into conflict for this particular view. So today we also see this whole thing happening, some sort of a fad, where the Charvaka or the Nastika view also is put in the same pedestal as a dharmic view, because we don't want to alienate a lot of modern day Hindus who are, for the lack of a better term, they are practically atheists. And for people who are trying to keep the flock together today in terms of contemporary discourse, they don't want to alienate that sort of a thinking. But at least we need to understand from a traditional standpoint that what does it mean to be somebody who recognizes no standard but your own? And what does it mean uh, if the entire society degenerates into becoming the slave of your own impulses and sensual cravings? And what is it that will police you from falling into that pit? So that is where I think the whole Rajadharma Dharmasastra discourse still has a role to play. that we shouldn't degenerate into an atheist morality sort of a phase, and we still need to understand what is the Dharmic view on these matters. And that is where I see that these lines from Professor Aiyangar still carry a lot of merit. So there are also a bunch of passages here in this book in terms of the sacred rights that the king and the kingdom and people at large needs to indulge in. This is where again today you may look at these things as religious and something to do with like priestly obligations kind of thing. But this is not how things operated back then, because there was an intense faith in the efficacy of these sacrifices and rites for the placation of divinities. So when somebody says that you need to do a particular yajna for the sake of placating a particular divinity or for the sake of a particular benefit, there was an intense faith in that as an ideal. And hence the entire society kind of rallied around it. The king supported these activities. And the whole conduct of this yajna is something that the entire society participated in. And all such rites had to be conducted under the direction or by the royal Purohita. So that functionary also was chosen with a great care. And the indication of the need to maintain the first Varna, which is Brahmins, is supported by specific advice on the necessity to perform with its help certain ceremonies in order that calamities threatening the kingdom may be averted and the favor of supernatural agencies may be secured. So here again, there is a lot of emphasis in terms of there is an intense faith in the efficacies of these sacrifices. So these are not merely seen as something that a set of priests or Brahmins are depending. These are things that everybody had an intense faith on. So Lakshmidhara actually recommends that every year two Laksha Homas must be performed, and in a reign, at least one Koti Homam must be performed for the removal of fear. And expiatory ceremonies should be done at eclipses and a Mahashanti when there is a like natural calamity like an earthquake. So the Dharmashastra or the Rajadharma manual is recommending all this to the king, that it is important that all these rites and sacrifices are performed. These were not seen as something that are like an offshoot or an afterthought for the king. It was fundamental to the conduct of the day-to-day obligations. And again, it was an age of intense faith in the efficacy of these sacrifices. So it is in this context that the Brahmins were deemed as an asset to the kingdom. Again, here, Professor Aiyangar puts a qualifier that it's not any and every Brahmin. It is only those Brahmins who discharged their appointed functions and did their dharma. This is why in times of colonization or even in the formation of fortified cities or fortresses, which were destined as refuge in times of national stress, the king is enjoined to fill these fortresses with Shrotriyas, which means Brahmins who are trained in those specific priestly or scholarly functions. Their decay leads to the weakening of the kingdom in every one of its elements. This is the meaning of the warning that the kingdom in which Brahmins perish of starvation, the kingdom itself perishes. So here again, Rangaswami Aiyangar is trying to explain the whole dynamic between the king and the priest. And again, for the modern mentality, some of these may feel a bit revolting, because for a lot of people, the whole idea of modernity is to get out of this uh, coupling between the king and the priest and the role of the priest and the priestly rights in the context of the society at large. A lot of Hindus like that whole sacred secular separation today, but this is a commentary on how things operated back then in the 11th or 12th century in a particular kingdom. So that's how we should perhaps see to it. And it is not getting too prescriptive about how things need to be conducted today. So again here, Lakshmidhara recommends some deities for the king. So he says that the king should specially worship two divinities. One is Kartikeya, to or Subramania Swami, the son of Lord Shiva and Parvati, to overcome enemies. And then Devi in her many manifestations, separately and also as residing in the royal sword, dagger, crown, sandals, and also embellish her figure on the royal stand. This will give him victory in the battle. So again here, the divinities were tightly coupled into the conduct of the kingdom and the kings. It was not something that was relegated to a religious sphere and a secular sphere like we do today. The entire identity of the kingdom and the king rested in these divinities. So here, this particular dynasty or kingdom, which is the Gahadwala kingdom in Kanauj, Varanasi, and Bihar, that belt, this had sprung in seething troubles of the age, and it was faced by a greater peril than any yet encountered. in the assaults of the Muslim invaders, whom the King Govindachandra had defeated, but they were destined ultimately to destroy his empire. So the kingdom's safety lay no longer in just rule or in the administration of Varnasrama Dharma, as it was in the past. So it is in this context that Lakshmidhara's work is coming, where this kingdom is already threatened by a lot of Muslim invasions. And the role of the king also was not just about just administering that everybody did their duties. There was an external threat and there was a lot of pressure. It is in this context that this whole work that came in, which is talking about divinities, which is talking about conducting particular rites, which is talking about how dharma is important for the day-to-day conduct. And at the same time, Lakshmidhara is also writing a lot of literature and scholarship here, asking people to stand up for their dharma, asking people to fight, and also appealing to the Kshatriya Tejas of the uh, Kshatriyas to say that people need to fight, and if you die in a battleground, that is perhaps the highest form of death, and that is not something that you should be afraid of. So you'll also find uh, this kind of sentences or this kind of passages in this book by Lakshmidhara, where he is also acknowledging that it is not some steady state situation. It is a state where there is an external strength and where things are being uh, there's a lot of imbalance and there's a lot of threat because of Muslim invasions. So it is not like the scholars of Dharma Shastra also operated in a very idealistic sort of a scenario. They were quite aware, and the kings were, of course, quite aware in terms of the pressures on their kingdoms. But despite that, they saw value in trying to understand this sort of a discourse. So I'll just conclude here with a couple of paragraphs from this work. So here, uh, Rangaswami Aiyangar says that the kingship is a necessary but not a natural institution. The deterioration of moral nature of the man made a controlling authority necessary to prevent the strong devouring the weak, which is in tradition it's called the Matsya, where the big fish consumes the small fish. So this whole idea of a controlling authority came up only because there was a deterioration of the moral nature of the man, and it is to prevent the strong devouring the weak that you need this controlling authority. So Dharma furnishes the preordained means of overcoming the downward pull in human action. An organization in Varna and Ashrama and in varied functions for each of these in its peculiar moral form, Gunadharma, arrests the human degradation and helps man to overcome the disposition to evil doing. So he's kind of trying to explain the whole Indian theory of the state. What is the role of the king? What is the role of these Varna and Ashrama Dharma? Why they even had to come up? And what is the role of the king in ensuring that these Varnashrama related functions and duties are abided by? So here he says that to miss any duty, however small, which is enjoined, is a dereliction. Whosoever be the person committing the default. The outlines of Dharma are inflexible. The determination of the extent to which there is freedom to act within the lines laid by Dharma is the task of jurisprudence and shishtas. In this sense, the constitution of every ancient Indian state was rigid. So it is not like an anything goes sort of a conception, which is perhaps where you'll end up with if you go back to the Charvaka or Nastika conception, because he's saying I don't have any standard based on which I'll measure thee. But here, the outlines of Dharma broadly or the overarching principles, they are inflexible. But there is indeed some flexibility, and that flexibility is something that is defined or revised from time to time by the jurisprudence and the shishtas. So this is the kind of model that the Indian theory of the state operated in. And the state, again, just to emphasize, was only one of the many devices for maintaining the balance. The king is not the sole upholder of the community. While he had an authority or he had a responsibility to make sure everybody was dharmic, but he was not the only authority. Spiritual authority has to cooperate with the secular. The king and the Brahmin uphold the universe. The society needs economic props, otherwise it crumbles. So the Vaishya and Shudra are no less necessary for the social stability than the Brahmana and the Kshatriya. This is symbolized in the rites of coronation. So in this book on Rajadharma Kanda, Lakshmidhara also has a lot of like detailed commentary in terms of coronation or the Abhisheka related rituals when a king is uh, the king is kind of starting his role, and for that role there are a set of rites that he has to go through before he officially takes over his duties. So even there, it is not something that is like specific to Brahmins and Kshatriyas, as Professor Aiyangar mentions here. The Vaishya and the Shudra were no less necessary for social stability than the Brahmin and the Kshatriya. So here again he says that the Varnas are not successive layers, one superimposed on another, but coordinate. So we have a picture which is like broadly pushed into our minds, where we see everything as a pyramid, where Shudras are at the bottom pile, then Vaishyas, then Kshatriyas, and then Brahmins. That's a pyramid sort of a construct that a lot of scholars and ideologues pushed onto us over generations. But here, the traditional interpretation, he says, is that they are not successive layers, one superimposed upon another, but these are coordinate layers. So in Dharma, there is social classification by birth and function, but no stratification. Similarly, the state functions side by side with non-political groups based on kinship, enterprise, occupation, voluntary organization, and the propinquity, which is proximity. So essentially, there are like multiple bodies. It is not just like there is the king and the king's dicta. There are also a lot of these bodies based on kinship, community, common enterprise, occupation, voluntary organization, your village bodies, and all of these together. And it is through all this that these were all devices for maintaining the balance of the universe. So the king was not the sole upholder, and the spiritual authority was cooperating with the secular authorities. So this again, this particular line here from Professor Aiyangar, that in Dharma there was classification by birth and function, but no stratification. Uh, this may again not appeal to a lot of people in contemporary times today. People like to believe that perhaps there was no classification by birth at no point in time ever. Well, that may be more textual or like a very specific interpretation, but it's not very clear whether it ever had any real world consequences. So this line that Professor Aiyangar has taken here seems more reasonable to me when I read it, that to see that Varnas were not successive layers, one superimposed on another, but coordinate layers. To see that Dharma was, there was no stratification, but yes, there was classification. And to see that the state functions side by side with many groups, it was not superimposed as one on top of another. This is perhaps a kind of conception of society through which one can reconcile uh, with the traditional society in modern times today. So that's broadly what I wanted to cover today. So just to recap, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the origins of this sacred secular separation and the implications of the sacred secular separation, and how the traditional Dharmic view doesn't have this secular, religious secular or sacred secular, public private kind of a separation, and it was seen as a holistic or like a continuum. So we spent some time at the start on that part of it. And then we spent a lot of time trying to understand the role of Shastras, Dharma Shastra and Rajadharma in particular. So if you look at this conception of a Dharmic society where people conduct their day-to-day lives to based on Dharmic ideals, then what is the role of Shastras in achieving that as an end state? What is the role of Dharma Shastras, and what is the role of king and the Rajadharma? So we spent some time there. And then briefly, we also try to understand that if you relegate Shastras and the Dharma Shastras, Rajadharma, all that to the private realm or to the sacred realm, and then try to define this whole notion of a secular morality, how does that operate in practice, and how would that avoid falling into this pit of getting into this Nastika morality or Atheist morality or a Charvaka morality or a Pashanda morality sort of a sphere, where people say that I don't have any standard but my own standard. So I define what is Dharma for me and I'll operate based on that. So how would you avoid going into that sort of a realm? In fact, if you stretch it a bit and try to picture that conception, you might perhaps end up with what is today called wokeism. So how would you avoid getting there, and how would you ensure that Dharma still has a play in determining day-to-day conduct and morale? So that's one aspect that we also talked about. And lastly, uh, what I want to implore to the audience who are listening to this is also that we need to study Shastras, Rajadharma, Varnasrama Dharma interface based on works like Professor Rangaswami Aiyangar. And in fact, if you're trained in Sanskrit, go back and read these works of the kind of Lakshmidhara's Krtyakalpataru, because they are really, they'll really help you understand how the society operated back then. And then come back with all of that study, then try it with the, so you have the contemporary situation. We have this whole Dharma modernity friction that is happening. We have the Enlightenment morality where we like to look at ourselves as individuals. We like to look at ourselves as individuals with their own liberty and freedom. And we don't want to hear from tradition that, hey, you should do this, you should not do this kind of thing. We like to have the freedom to define what we want to be. So these are all things that have changed with the advent of modernity. And of course, there is also the ever-changing industrial technology epoch. So this ancient sort of a model of a Varnasrama, sort of a model that Rangaswami Aiyangar alluded to, where you have occupational mobility is strictly controlled by the caste order or by the king or the Dharmic orders. That sort of a model doesn't exist anymore. Nobody can even ensure occupations to everybody. So it is like a kind of a fight and a struggle for existence for everybody. So these things have changed. But even with all of these things changing, what is it that we can cling on to? And what is the role that Dharma Shastras and books on Rajadharma, they have what is the role that they have in our times today, given all of this change? So given that you're running the country based on a secular constitution, given that in terms of our day-to-day conduct itself, we are like living 3 to 4 generations with a lot of disconnect with Sanatan Dharma. What do we do now? These are all questions that we need to grapple with in this generation. Works like this really help you understand how things operated back then. And then these are questions that we can pose to ourselves more in a contemplative mode to understand what does it mean for my times today. And it's on that note that I'd like to end this talk today. Thanks to CIS for giving me this opportunity to discuss this topic. The whole idea of me trying to bring up this topic today is just to popularize this kind of traditional scholarship that existed uh, back 7 or 8 decades ago, and also bemoan the fact that this kind of scholarship doesn't exist as much today. So I'm just trying to emphasize the fact that we need to engage more and more with our own traditional scholarships, and then really construct this image of tradition in our heads and not go by like the flavor of the season or what a bunch of ideologues are trying to push. So it's on that note that I'd like to conclude.